Throes of the Watchmaker, the new DLC for Sea of Stars, does something that most indie devs cannot physically do, but perhaps more importantly, they didn't have to do it, and I think that's part of why it's so impactful. So Sabotage Studios sponsored this video and asked me if I wanted to take a look at their new DLC. Now, before we go any further, I think it's important to establish why DLC exists. Not this one specifically, but DLC in general. What's the goal? That answer is going to vary depending on who you ask, but my answer has always been to create an experience that gives players more of what they already loved in the base game, while providing something that feels distinctly fresh and new. I am not saying Throes of the Watchmaker is perfect, no game is, but I am saying that it does exactly what I think a DLC is supposed to do. Oh, and it's free. So check out the link in the description, or if you're completely insane, you can type it out one character at a time and just stare at the link on screen. It's the same link, just click the one in the description. And don't worry about spoilers, I'll be extremely vague and I'll only show things from early in the DLC. If I do show anything past the first hour or two, I'll let you know in advance. I want to start with the base game so we have a benchmark for what we're looking for in the DLC. By far my favorite part of Sea of Stars was the gameplay. The game was made by the same people who made The Messenger, a 2D platformer, and you can see that DNA everywhere here. The grappling hook that lets you soar through the sky and latch onto walls, the vertical environments the likes of which I've never really seen in a game like this, and the variety of obstacles that you constantly have to overcome all work together to make just the simple act of going from point A to point B genuinely enjoyable. If this game literally just had the grappling hook and nothing else, no climbing, no swimming, nothing, just the hook, the general movement and traversal would still be outstanding, especially for a JRPG. The hook lets you grab onto these posts and launch yourself over them in a straight line. It seems simple, and effectively it is, but that's the key. It doesn't need to be complicated. This isn't a platformer. There's this incredible level of restraint in the gameplay of Sea of Stars. My personal favorite example of this are the puzzles. These are the perfect length, and they last just long enough that you feel engaged in this distinctly different activity, but are nowhere near challenging enough that you'll find yourself stuck on the same section for hours at a time. The game knows it's not a puzzle game in the same way that it knows it's not a platformer. As a result of this, while both of those aspects of the gameplay are fantastic here, neither one overstays its welcome. The combat, on the other hand, could be considered the most important part of the gameplay, so let's go a bit more in depth on that. Combat in Sea of Stars is turn-based, but it makes a lot of significant changes to the traditional formula. The roles and personalities of the characters are reflected through their attacks in the gameplay. Garl, for example, is a chef. He fights with a pot lid. Zale is a fighter who utilizes the power of the sun. He shoots fireballs. Pretty straightforward stuff, nothing especially groundbreaking. More importantly though, we've got story bosses that, for reasons I won't explain due to spoilers, are particularly weak to our dual protagonists, Zale and Valir. This weakness is reflected in the gameplay, where the damage of the Solstice Warriors, that's these two, will be extraordinarily high when compared to everyone else. This is just a bit of ludonarrative harmony, and I really appreciate it when games are able to do things like this. Now this is where we can finally get to that whole thing about changes to the traditional formula. The biggest challenge that turn-based games have to face is how to make the game engaging when the player has no real control over what happens in between turns. For example, in Metaphor, once I've used all of my actions, there is literally nothing I can do. If this attack is going to deal enough damage to send my HP to 0, assuming it hits, I'm cooked. That's all there is to it. The opposite is also true. If I use an attack that's going to drop an enemy's HP to 0, again, assuming it hits, there's nothing they can do. This in no way means the combat is bad. In the same way that there are only so many buttons on a controller, it's just an inherent limitation that you have to contend with when designing combat around this system. Sea of Stars, while being a turn-based game, makes some interesting choices to separate itself from this limitation. By timing your button presses, you can actually block and mitigate the damage of incoming attacks. Equally, you can increase the damage of your own attacks by timing button presses as well. In this way, they quickly overcome that limitation and create a system that still feels turn-based because, well, it is. Yet thanks to these timed attacks and guards, the combat feels far more satisfying than it would have without them. Crucially, all three of these individual sections, the puzzles, the platforming, and the combat, were never there for a moment longer than they needed to be. Because of the game's ability to constantly and effortlessly swap between the three, the gameplay is able to remain fresh, exciting, and engaging regardless of which one you're currently going through. Okay, with that quick refresher out of the way, let's jump into the DLC. Throes of the Watchmaker is much better than I thought it would be. Now, just to be clear, I didn't walk in expecting it to be bad by any means, but if I had to use one word to describe this DLC, it would be experienced. The whole thing feels more refined, more precise than the base game was. It's only about 10 hours long, but in those 10 hours, I can't recall a single wasted second. Yet, it's not just a super dense version of the base game, it's more than that. It takes the lessons learned there and executes them wonderfully to create an experience that feels like the best 10 hours of the entire game. Let's start with the puzzles, and so sort of the platforming since those two go hand in hand. So Watchmaker has these mini dungeons that you shrink yourself down to access. Once inside, you complete short puzzles and either grab a collectible or open a path forward. These puzzles can vary dramatically from sliding block puzzles to simple dials that you have to rotate to create an image, but they all follow two simple rules. First, as I said, they're always short. This is necessary as you find these mini dungeons all over the place and sometimes need to complete them to progress. If you were in the middle of a tense story section chasing down the antagonist, then got stopped by a puzzle that took you an hour to complete, a lot of that tension would quickly fade away. Thankfully, that's not the case here. I never spent more than 15 minutes on any of these and completed the overwhelming majority of them in 3 to 5. The second rule is that all of these mini dungeons are self-contained. What I mean by that is the solution to the mini dungeon always exists inside of that mini dungeon. The only exception to this is the item that you get around halfway through that will be required for some of them, but it's extremely obvious when that's the case. The reason this is so important is because it ensures that even in the rare occasions where you do get stuck on a puzzle, you know for a fact that the solution is somewhere in this room. Eventually, you will figure it out with enough guessing if it comes to that. These two rules together allow the mini dungeons to do the very same thing that the base game's puzzles do. They act as supplementary content that doesn't take up any more time and space than they need to. The platforming as well is as good as ever. The whole DLC takes place in a carnival-esque setting, and they use that identity to create some outstanding platforming sections. There are these new spring block platforms that you can use your grappling hook on to launch off of and cross even wider gaps than in the base game, and of course the occasional tightrope is basically necessary considering the environment. What really stands out here more than anything though is the level design. There are so many moments in this DLC where you'll complete a task, open a door or kick down a ladder, and suddenly find yourself right back at the start of the area. My favorite example of this is in the third dungeon, but again, to avoid spoilers I won't say too much, just that this dungeon is the perfect representation of that cyclical level design philosophy. On top of all of this, the game uses these clever shortcuts to create a path out of the dungeon as well. Instead of getting the classic portal at the boss that teleports you back to the start, some part of the dungeon will open up and you'll suddenly have this fantastic realization of exactly how you're gonna get back. The DLC takes these dungeons, puzzles, and platforming sections and puts them in a new setting that doesn't just fit all three, but enhances them as well. Okay, now let's finally talk about combat, something that I can actually discuss without worrying too much about spoilers. So when the DLC begins, you'll switch to these new classes to fit the carnival aesthetic, and with these new classes come new skills. My favorite part of the base game were the unique actions you could take during combat. Venom Flurry with Sarai was somehow just as exhilarating in hour 5 as it was in hour 40. Now, it's totally possible that I just really enjoy timed button presses that cause numbers to go up, like when people hit the subscribe button, but that's neither here nor there. Watchmaker takes these unique actions to another level. It really leans into this carnival aesthetic with these new skills that they've added by creating some of the most fun attacks in the game. The very first one you gain access to is called Cannonball Trampoline. This skill has already launched a few cannonballs into the air before quickly pulling out a trampoline to catch them. The balls bounce off of the enemy's heads, then create these small pink reticles on the ground. Your goal is to rush over to these before the cannonball hits the ground. I cannot stress how much I used this skill in my playthrough of the DLC. I don't even know if it's the best skill, but diving in like a volleyball player at the last moment to get that little bit of extra damage was always immensely satisfying. This skill is also a great example of that interaction-heavy turn-based combat that I mentioned earlier. The difference between the lowest damage this skill can do and the highest is enormous, and it's entirely based on your own abilities and reflexes. You can even empower this attack with the live magic system. Doing so will allow you to launch more than just 2 cannonballs into the air. You don't have to juggle all 4 of them at the same time, of course. No, these extras instead act like a safety net, as if you miss one, you'll get another from the reserves. My only problem with this is, and it's a small thing, but sometimes on some enemies the reticle can appear under their locks, and if they have a big enough box of locks, it can be hard to see the reticle before it's too late. Outside of that, this is probably my second or third favorite normal skill in the game, but my favorite normal skill has to be one of the first ones that Valir obtains, Loonbow. This is a brilliant skill, and whoever proposed this idea needs a raise. I'm not just glazing needlessly, I'm completely serious when I say this might be my favorite skill in the entire game. Okay, let me explain. So Loonbow sees Valir assume the limbo position and prepare for these beams of light. There are 2 types, red and blue. Blue will heal the entire party, while red will damage all of the enemies on screen. The catch is that you have to duck under the red ones while deliberately getting hit by the blues. If you get hit by even one red beam, the skill instantly ends and you leave with what you've managed to get so far. However, if you duck under a blue beam, the skill doesn't end, you just miss out on a bit of healing. Maybe you can already see why I love this skill so much. Normally in minigames like this, you'll see 3 or 4 red beams fly at you and think, come on, can I get just one blue please? But then you'll realize that while that string of reds was dangerous and had the potential to end your attack early, it also means that the enemies just took a ton of damage. It's in this backwards way that you almost want the game to send some more reds your your way in spite of the danger that they present. Furthermore, because this skill doesn't end if you dodge a blue, you might find yourself in a position where you decide that it's safer to just dodge the blue if it means avoiding a red as well. Sure, you'll miss out on some healing, but maybe you don't need it so badly that you're willing to risk ending the entire skill. This game of risk-reward is even further emphasized by the fact that you obviously can't just hold the limbo pose forever. If you stay down for too long, you'll fall over and the skill will instantly end. So now you've got another question. Do you want to stay down for longer to ensure that you can safely dodge everything right now? Or do you want to minimize your time on the ground to prepare for a potentially perilous string later where you might have to stay down for longer? This skill is outstanding, and if Sabotage decides to make more games like this in the future, I sincerely hope they add more attacks similar to this one. Bosses here are exceptional too, and much like the skills, the DLC is home to my favorite boss in the game as well. But, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record at this point, I won't say too much else, since I think a lot of the fun in these bosses is experiencing them for yourself totally blind. Finally, there are two things that shocked me with this DLC, one that I already revealed at the start, and one that I realized as I played through it. Remember how I mentioned the whole enhanced version of the base game thing earlier? I think in many ways that is Throes of the Watchmaker. It is Sea of Stars plus a few extra years of experience and a ton of over-the-top outlandish ideas. However, it's also home to a surprisingly impactful story that does an excellent job of aiding what I considered to be one of the base game's weakest elements, the main characters Valir and Zale. They seemed pretty boring and flat in the base game, but the DLC gives both of them a chance for some serious development that adds a fair bit of depth to their characters, and while I won't pretend this is the single greatest written piece of media humanity has ever created, I think it's a large step in the right direction. If you hated Sea of Stars, I really don't think this is going to change that, but if you were impartial or just want to see a bit more from these characters, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what's on display here. The biggest surprise though is the fact that this DLC, along with the Dawn of Equinox update from last November, are totally free. Sea of Stars was not just one of the most successful indie games of 2023, it is one of the most successful indie games of all time. Public perception towards the game is extraordinary, and it reviewed incredibly well. The devs didn't have to make the Dawn of Equinox update that aimed to make the combat even better, an update that added my personal favorite change, the combo meter persisting through fights. Thanks to this, you can access your combo attacks far more often. In regards to Watchmaker, if they chose to charge, I don't know, $10, $15 for it, nobody would have batted an eye. Equally, I don't think anyone was expecting the main characters to receive significant development here. Now, of course, I'm not saying this should be the standard. Most indie devs can't afford to create content for free, they're just not big enough. But my point here is Sabotage didn't have to do any of this, yet they still did. They went above and beyond to create the best experience they possibly could, and I think that's really something worth appreciating. So if the game seems interesting to you, check out the link in the description. It's like 50 hours of content with Throes of the Watchmaker included. And if you already have it, then just launch the game and go play the DLC. It's great, I think you'll like it a lot.